On a quiet morning, long before the studio lights flickered on and the teleprompter began its steady crawl, Craig Melvin sat alone at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, the television muted but glowing faintly in the background, replaying images that had already begun to settle heavily across the country's conscience. In moments like these, after nights when breaking news carried the weight of tragedy, he often woke earlier than usual, not because of an alarm, but because the mind of a broadcaster rarely rests when a nation is grieving. And while millions would soon see him composed behind the desk, delivering facts with clarity and calm, the quieter truth lived in these early hours when the stories he reported were not just headlines, but human echoes that followed him home. Lindsay Charniak understood this rhythm well. Years in journalism had given her the same instinctive awareness of how deeply a story could burrow into someone whose job required both empathy and composure. And as she stepped into the kitchen, she could see it immediately. The thoughtful stillness, the distant gaze, the way Craig's fingers circled the rim of the mug, as though grounding himself before another day of translating sorrow into language the public could absorb. They rarely spoke about the hardest stories in dramatic ways. Instead, their conversations unfolded gently, like two people passing a fragile object between them, acknowledging that behind every statistic was a family waking up to a life permanently changed. For Craig, the challenge was never simply reading the news. It was carrying the invisible responsibility of representing the emotions of viewers who watched while sitting at their own kitchen tables, wondering how the world could change so suddenly. He knew that in the quiet seconds before a broadcast resumed after difficult footage, millions of eyes searched the anchor's face for reassurance. Not that everything was fine, but that someone else was steady enough to guide them through the uncertainty. Over the years, he had developed small rituals that few viewers would ever know: a slow breath before introducing a story about loss, a momentary pause after a particularly painful report, and sometimes the deliberate choice to look directly into the camera with a softness that communicated what words could not, that empathy still had a place in journalism. Lindsay often reminded him that those small gestures mattered more than ratings or viral clips. She had seen the emails from viewers who said that his calm presence made frightening mornings feel a little less overwhelming, and she believed those moments revealed the true purpose of broadcasting: to help people process the emotional chaos of the world together rather than alone. Yet, even with that understanding, Craig sometimes felt the quiet accumulation of stories that lingered long after the cameras turned off. Disasters, community tragedies, families whose names the public would forget, but whose faces he remembered with uncomfortable clarity. It was during evening walks with Lindsay that he allowed those memories to surface, speaking not as an anchor, but simply as a husband reflecting on the strange privilege and burden of witnessing history in real time. For Lindsay, those walks were less about solving anything and more about creating space where the weight could be shared, because she knew that journalists who cared deeply often carried the heaviest emotional load. Together, they would talk about resilience, not the loud, triumphant kind often celebrated on television, but the quieter resilience of communities rebuilding, neighbors helping strangers, and families finding ways to continue after loss. Craig found comfort in those stories because they reminded him that tragedy was never the whole narrative. Every painful headline was accompanied somewhere by kindness, and part of his responsibility was making sure those moments of humanity were not overlooked. As the years passed, the role of a news anchor subtly evolved for him. It was no longer just about delivering information quickly, but about helping viewers navigate the emotional meaning behind events that felt overwhelming. Audiences, especially those who had lived through decades of historical upheaval, recognized authenticity when they saw it, and Craig believed that people did not expect perfection from journalists. They simply hoped for honesty, steadiness, and compassion. On mornings after particularly difficult news cycles, Lindsay would sometimes place a hand gently on his shoulder before he left for the studio, a quiet reminder that behind the public role existed a private life grounded in love and perspective. It was a small gesture, but it helped him remember that the purpose of telling hard stories was not to dwell in despair, but to acknowledge shared vulnerability. When Craig finally sat at the anchor desk and the countdown began, 5, 4, 3, the transformation that viewers saw was not a mask, but a form of service, the ability to gather complicated emotions, steady them, and present the truth in a way that allowed the country to face it together. And later, when the broadcast ended and the lights dimmed, he would return home where the silence felt different from the studio's quiet, a deeper, more personal calm, where the day's headlines slowly dissolved into ordinary conversation, laughter, and the comforting knowledge that while the world often delivered heartbreak, it also offered the enduring strength of connection, the same strength that allowed people like Craig and Lindsay to continue meeting each day's news not with detachment, but with a deliberate, hopeful belief that empathy, quiet, patient, and human, still had the power to hold a nation together.